Halo Sobat Finansial, jumpa lagi dalam acara Podcast Media Asuransi. Kali ini kita berkesempatan untuk mengundang narasumber yang sangat spesial, yaitu Karan Mohla, partner B Capital, yang akan membahas perihal startup industri. Seperti kita ketahui, krisis ekonomi global juga sangat berdampak ke industri startup, tidak hanya di Indonesia, tetapi juga secara global di dunia. Nanti kita akan berbincang-bincang lebih lanjut dengan Karan, kira-kira seperti apa risk appetite dari venture capital dalam memilih atau mencari startup yang potensial untuk didanai dan prospektif ke depannya. Oke, tanpa berlama-lama langsung aja kita berkenalan dengan Karan. Halo Karan.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me here.
Thank you for your time. It's such an honor for me and Media Asuransi to have you in our podcast. Startup industry in Indonesia is very, very fast growing, maybe about 10 years behind. We have very many startup, unicorn, decacorn, and very exciting young people and millennial in Indonesia want to work and to rise to build a startup in Indonesia. Maybe you can share your insight for venture capitalists for the industry in startup in Indonesia especially, and startup in global maybe, Karan. Okay, first question, in the current global economic crisis, what is your view for venture capital strategy in hunting for potential startup, Karan?
Look, great question to start off the discussion with. So in many ways, having been through some of these sort of cycles in the past, I think one is to understand that this is a cycle. As you have exuberance of the last 2 years, there will be down cycles and it'll come back up. Overall, I think we remain very committed and very positive about the outlook in Southeast Asia, especially as one of the key drivers of innovation globally in the world. And the interesting thing that what we're observing is some of the trends that we're seeing in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia, where it's actually being led by Indonesia more than any other country. The positive feeling in the ecosystem is amongst the highest in the world, both with founders as well as investors. Yes, there's been a little bit of a slowdown, but I think that was bound to happen given the pace of activity of the last 1 year, 2 years actually. Excuse me. But I think overall we feel that this is, for us, to look at the region is a very interesting time. And I'll share maybe why that's so. Traditionally, B Capital has been more of a growth stage and late stage investor. As you know, we raised the Ascent Fund, we announced it a few months back, and primarily to invest into early stage in the US, into India, into Indonesia, and other parts of Southeast Asia. And that goes with our global focus. And what we also realize being globally focused is not all regions in the world will be moving at the same pace at the same point in time. So today, Indonesia and India are probably a little bit more positive, whereas the US is a little bit more cautious. So for us, actually in this time, it's the best time to be an investor where you can actually be out there even more so than we were before, meeting with founders, and really understanding what is the driver of the next level of innovation in the country. And that really requires a lot of time being spent with founders, time being spent with other people in the industry. And through those conversations, I think you build relationships, but you also find, as your question says, how do you hunt for startups? Hunting for startups is a process. And it's by building some of these relationships and spending time on the ground, which is exactly what we're doing. I'm in Indonesia a few days a month, every month. So I spend time. We've got a colleague who also spends most of her time there. And so it's really understanding the drivers at the ground level, which sometimes in a market which is moving very quickly, you don't get the time to do that. Today, we're actually getting the time to do that and really spend time at a ground level. So for me, when I look at the question, I think that's the best way of hunting for deals. And this market provides the best opportunities for some of those kinds of investments.
Okay. Basically, any particular countries or industry that you targeting in B Capital for startup for now, like in crisis or economic crisis like this, maybe, Karan?
Yeah. So look, our focus is the US, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and parts of Southeast Asia. But I think the main focus is the first 3 or 4 countries that I mentioned. And why? I think it's because of the size of population, the size of the industry, and also the potential in technology, right? Because we are a technology-focused investor. For us, I think some of the trends that we're seeing in the last few months really tend to be around models which are going deeper on the domestic consumption, either for users or for businesses, which include a lot of B2B platforms, because especially in India and in Indonesia, a lot of the traditional industries are very fragmented and have not been digitized over the last 5 to 10 years. COVID has actually given them opportunity to actually go ahead and do that. And what we're trying to solve for really is how the fragmentation on the supply side for industries such as agriculture, construction material, commodities, packaging. Take the top 15 industries of GDP contribution, you can break that down. And you see how you can defragment and aggregate those industries. So that's one. I think the second is around fintech, and especially in Indonesia, Vietnam, and in India, the level and the innovation of fintech has gone a long way, but there's still a lot to do, because I think a lot of on the user side, there's a push towards digitization. Again, the business side, I think businesses have been slower to digitize on financial services, on payments, on lending. But that's where fintech can actually play a very large role. And when you look at any large innovation that's happened globally in tech, fintech has played a very, very important role in actually being a very key driver of that innovation. So we do think continuing to spend time in fintech is an interesting area for us. And then areas which drive domestic consumption, because while there are inflationary pressures, domestic consumption has not necessarily been hit yet in Asia, in India, Southeast Asia especially. It may happen in the next 5 to 6 months. So we have to be careful. But domestic consumption and drivers which relate to things like logistics, supply chain, transportation, mobility, I think those are areas that we continue to focus on, because those are helping build the economy for the next 20, 30, 40 years. So that's, I think, how we look at certain sectors in this market.
Okay. And then how many portfolio do you have in Big Capital for now, for the startup? And what is the biggest one for the industry maybe?
Biggest one is an interesting one. It's hard for me to remember which is the biggest one. But overall in B Capital, we've invested at an aggregate level. We've invested over 100 companies. On the early stage side, we've invested in about 25 companies. And that continues to be a big focus area for us. And very difficult to say on the biggest one in terms by dollars. But look, we've been invested in some of the notable companies in the region, predominantly from our growth fund, because they've been around and helped build up the capital platform over the years. But if I look at especially the region, I would say companies like Byju's in India, Kopi in Indonesia, I think are some of our Ninja Van in Singapore. So these are some of our larger companies, but there is, like I said, 100+ companies.
Okay. What is the main consideration of your venture capital to providing funding in the startup, like in the middle of crisis like now maybe?
That's a very good question. And I think the criteria sometimes changes based on how the market is. But I think the first thing that we always look for is really around the founders and the founding team. Because without the founding team, it could be the best market, best business, but the business will not work. So our business is really about the right people and the right kind of leaders that drive that. So in this market, that probably becomes even more important. And that's why actually spending time with founders, I think Zoom has been great. Working virtually has been great, but actually being face to face with founders really, really helps early stage. So that's why we spend time on the ground in India, Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam. So founders become the most important things. I think beyond that, obviously, is looking at the market and the addressable nature of the market, but more importantly, because we're investing for 7, 8, 9, 10 years sometimes. You actually want to see how the market will probably develop. So a little bit of it is vision gazing into the future and putting a bet in terms of how you think that market will evolve. The third part of it is just around where technology plays a role in disrupting the existing business if it's offline. So there's two types of businesses where you need technology to disrupt existing ways of working and really digitize it. And then there's a second way, you're actually creating markets which may not exist today. And their technology plays a role in building the market. So actually understanding this nuance becomes important. And then fourthly, fourth point is how the companies will scale up, right? Where is the capital going to be utilized for growth? If it's all in marketing and not so much in product development, not so much on the team, not so much on engineering, then it becomes a question of like, where is the defensibility in this business, right? Where is that moat around the business that somebody will find it very difficult to come and do the exact same thing? I think those are probably 4 areas that we look at most closely. There's probably another 4, but I think that's kind of where at early stage it makes a difference, and it's important to go deep into these 4 areas.
We heard a lot about startup bubble in the media, globally and in Indonesia. I just wondering, for venture capitalists, it makes a break for give the funding to the startup, or just more selective to make a funding to the startup? What about?
Yeah. No, that's an interesting question. I think one thing when you take a step back, macro environments do dictate how the behavior of everybody is. So in a situation where there is some level of cautiousness, there will be cautiousness on the investing side as well. I think the difference is compared to some of the other cycles that I've seen, it's not been a complete drop off. Things have not gone like this and then fallen off. It's maybe a slow, small fall, a small break. And my belief is it'll come back. Now, whether it comes back in 12 months or 24 months, very hard to say. But in Southeast Asia and in India, I think the break has been much less so than the US.
Okay.
What that also allows is for founders to actually understand why they want to raise and who they want to raise from, and for investors to do the same thing. I joked with someone recently, it's back to how we were investing in 2019 and 2020 before COVID. It's just back to how things were then. It's much slower than it was in 2021. That's why we feel it's a break, or we feel that things have fallen off. But it's actually just normalized back to how things were.
Which industry do you view still potential for the future, Karan, for startup industry?
So I mentioned B2B, and I think that's definitely one. I think one big area of need in Asia, especially in the emerging markets, is around health. I think in education, there's already been some strides made. I think in healthcare, both in India as well as in Indonesia, I see it's such a big, there's a huge gap between what's available and what people can actually access and what people can actually use. So I think healthcare will have to play a big role in bridging that. And especially because of the lack of infrastructure, digital healthcare becomes even more important. So I think that's maybe a 10-year trend that I see happening, over the next in this region. And then I think lastly is around, climate tech, sustainability, clean investing or clean tech investing. Those areas become very important because that's a 20-30-year trend, right? I think everybody has a responsibility to get to a place where we can put our planet in a better shape than it is. And those technologies are now starting to get commercialized. Those technologies are now starting to get used in emerging markets like India, Indonesia. In Europe and the US, I think they've been ongoing for the last 4 or 5 years. But in this region, I think they've just started in the last year or so, frankly. So that's a huge opportunity because as 2 of the largest consumers of energy and had 2 of the largest emitters of carbon in the world, I think we have there will be those opportunities for people to actually do something about it. So I think those are probably two other areas that we will probably spend time on as well.
Okay. Speaking about startup bubble, what do you think the cause of this phenomena in the world industry startup maybe, Karan?
I think the core reason is there was a lack of very affordable capital in the system, which started from public markets to private markets to early stage markets. And everybody had a lot of capital that was available. Number one. I think number two was the fact that because we were all virtual, decision making became a little bit easier. And hence, when there was excess capital and quicker decision making, the cycle times got shorter. And that led to what felt was a little bit of a untenable situation in the early part of this year. And I think that's starting to get corrected very clearly now. Because I think, capital which is easily available is no longer there, especially from a central bank level. And as the world goes back to a more normalized setting, decision-making cycles have gone back to what they were before. So I think both those contributing factors actually dissipated to a large extent today.
And do you think it's necessary, like a startup bubble like this, many startup bankruptcy and the quality is more higher, or what, Karan?
Yeah, so like every cycle, there are pros and cons, and I think the pro part of this is primarily because when a situation is untenable, which means that same pace cannot be maintained of deployment and growth, then there needs to be some level of correction, which is what we've seen. That correction means some companies may not survive this cycle. Unfortunately, there will be layoffs. Unfortunately, there will be capital which will be harder to come by. But that also means that the quality of companies, as you very rightly said, that survives or that thrives in this market is significantly higher. And so what we see as a vintage from 2022, 5-10 years from now, my belief is going to be very, very high. It may be actually better than a 2021 vintage because there was so much activity happening. This year, I think it's a lot more selective. So I think you're absolutely right. It helps with just course correcting and going back to the normal. The difference is in 2019, the normal was at one level. 2022, even though it's normalized, the normal is at a different level because capital on an absolute basis is still more than 3 years back. The quality of companies is by far and away much better now than it was 3 years back. And investors and founders are also much smarter. Hopefully some investors.
Okay.
So I think that helps with how the quality keeps going up each cycle.
Okay. In your point of view, what should a startup or founders respond to crisis like this to get a funding or survive the company? Maybe what is your view, Karan?
Yeah, a great question, and that's I think what we're seeing now. So I think founders who are resilient, number one, founders who have a very clear vision of what they want to do and why they're doing it, and I think what those kinds of founders are able to do is really find ways they find whatever it takes to get it done. Their vision and their ability to get to the end goal is very, very high. I think those are two things. The third is, I think higher focus on execution in this market becomes important, and not everybody executes at the same pace or at the same quality. So the founders who execute, exceptionally well really, really stand out even more so. Because in a market which is tight, you will see those founders executing even better. But in a market where everybody's doing well, it's very hard to distinguish. So I think to me, resiliency, just clarity of vision, and a focus on relentless execution. I think those three, especially in this market, really, really do well.
Okay. Especially in Indonesia, how do you see the startup industry in Indonesia, Karan, for now?
I am super bullish. I was in Jakarta last week, and I was also in Bali for Nexicon last week. And it was my first time at Nexicon.
Okay, Nexicon.
It was amazing to see what seemed like thousands of people, thousands of founders. It was a superbly well-organized event. And I think what amazed me was at the scale at which the event was organized. quality of companies, the clarity of the founders, as I mentioned, and I think how investors in generally are feeling about the startup ecosystem in Indonesia continues to be high. So I'm very, very bullish on Indonesia. I'm sorry, one area that I forgot to mention, which we focus on and we will focus on going is around Web3 and everything that goes around that. I think we will be a little bit more not picky, but I think we will pick and choose our bets in Web3, but we'll be more on the infrastructure and the tool side. And again, it was great to see there was one day which was just focused on Web3. Just the ecosystem there is amazing. So I'm super bullish on Indonesia as a country in terms of size, as the way the growth rate is growing, the way the per capita consumption is happening, the way the domestic capital industry is organized, and I think the impetus that the government is giving to help startups and early stage founders succeed.
Yeah, okay.
I think those are the elements which you need for a ecosystem, to really thrive. What I think is missing, but I think will happen, is just the ability of companies to exit and list publicly, whether it's on, in IDX or SGX or the US. You want that to happen because you want companies to list. That is something we saw in India happen very much in 2021, where we had 8 or 9 tech companies list all over $1 billion, mostly actually. And there were probably another 20 that would have gone public late last year, early this year, but because of the market, slowed down. I think that's the one thing in both India and definitely Indonesia really is just public technology companies. That I think is the picture and the framework for the ecosystem.
Okay. Any market that currently you targeting in the future? Maybe beside 4 country that you say in the beginning, Daddy.
No, I think our focus will continue to be on those 4 markets because those are the 4 largest. We see a lot of activity across Southeast Asia, in Thailand, in the Philippines, and of course in Singapore, but that's already a focus. But Thailand and Philippines, we do continue to track. Just in terms of overall activity, it's still Indonesia and then Vietnam in the region.
Okay. Maybe last question. What is your view about startup industry in the future? Besides the crisis like now, maybe in the future will grow more faster or slowly or what? Maybe, Karan.
I'm very, very bullish on the startup ecosystem.
Okay.
I think especially for countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines in region, startups and the tech ecosystem plays a very important role. I think in Indonesia, definitely, I've seen it now. Vietnam is starting to, I think it's transitioned away from being a niche to being part of the mainstream.
Okay.
And that shift actually helps it become more important because I think then everybody in the country realizes it's not some cool thing 1,000 people are doing. It's a very big driver of how the economy will grow and where the future is, and where value will get created. And especially as young countries, as Indonesia and India and Vietnam are, that move towards more of a tech-led economy becomes more important. So I hope, over the next 10 years, tech continues to become more and more mainstream. I have no doubt that it will. This is something I used to think about in India, and I think the same in Indonesia. You want the main stock index. In India, it's BSE 30. You want the 30 companies, maybe at least half of them to be tech companies 10, 15 years from now, because then those are the ones driving, the economy. I hope that for Indonesia. I hope that for Vietnam too, because then, as much as manufacturing and everything and services in India's case has done for the economy, you want tech to do that for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And that's where I see just the potential being limitless right now.
Okay. Very, very last question. Any particular strategy for B Capital to compete with other venture capital to hunting startup, maybe a potential startup, Karan?
So I can't reveal all our secrets, but I think,
Okay.
but I think some of the things that we do feel genuinely so is, because we're a global fund, we like to partner with people who are building out, platforms locally. I was part of a platform that built, India's largest domestic VC fund as it stands today. And I have a huge amount of respect for people who've done that in India and in Indonesia and are now doing that in Vietnam. I think as a global fund, we're able to bring in a very different kind of perspective, but we're still local. But we want to work even more closely with local firms or global firms who are based in the region. I think we're very cooperative by nature. We want to collaborate. And there's different things we can get, right? Because we have a global platform, we have a multi-stage investment platform. We're focused on a few industries. We've got the industry connects. For us, it's about furthering the ecosystem and expanding it and making it better for everybody else. And that's what I think a lot of my meetings at Nexicon were about, just talking about what we're wanting to do and working together with all investors in the region.
Okay. Thank you, Karan, for your time. Very interesting, the discussion. I hope your insightful point of view will very meaningful for our viewers and readers in Indonesia. I hope we meet again next time, Karan.
Thank you so much
for your time and for your point of view. Oke, Sobat Finansial, itu tadi perbincangan kita dengan Karan Mohla, partner B Capital, terkait strategi venture capital dalam berburu startup yang potensial di masa krisis seperti sekarang ini. Semoga memberikan ilmu dan manfaat yang lebih besar buat kita semua dan juga tentunya bagi para startup di Indonesia ya ke depannya. Sampai jumpa lagi di Podcast Media Asuransi di lain kesempatan dengan topik dan narasumber yang tidak kalah menarik lagi. Selamat siang dan sampai jumpa.